Welcome to the Nanovation Podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com.
I wanted to be a lawyer because I like to argue, and it turns out that you know this, Mike. Like when we defend our work, and when we write proposals, and when we answer reviewers' comments, we're actually making arguments, right?
Oh, 100%. Oh, yeah.
So I think I got a little bit of that lawyer stuff in my work too.
That's Malancha Gupta from the University of Southern California, talking about the central role that argument and debate play in the day-to-day practice of science and engineering. Malancha's lab focuses on initiated chemical vapor deposition, or iCVD. iCVD is a relatively new technique for depositing functional polymer thin films. Because polymer properties are readily tunable, iCVD can impart a nearly limitless number of surface functionalities. Perhaps most importantly, the mild nature of iCVD makes it compatible with delicate substrates such as paper, cells, and even liquids. Yes, you heard me right. She can deposit materials on liquid surfaces. In addition to talking shop, Malancha recounts her meandering journey from curious undergrad to professor. She also shares several of the life hacks that helped her along the way. Be sure to stay to the end to find out what trait, which she imported from New York City, makes her stick out like a sore thumb in Los Angeles. I find Malancha's openness to be delightfully refreshing, and I think you'll agree. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. So it is my pleasure to have Dr. Malancha Gupta, newly named professor of chemical engineering, just given the promotion from associate professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, as well as material science and chemistry at the University of Southern California. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So real quick, you have a really long title. Not only are you now a full professor, but you were also the early career chair. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you're in 3 departments. What's the deal there?
So at USC, the chemical engineering department is merged with the material science department. So I'm at the Mork family department of chemical engineering and material science. Even though my background is all in chemical engineering. So we have a joint department. But what's also a little confusing is petroleum is also in our department as well. It's just not in the title. So we actually have an undergraduate degree program in just chemical engineering in our department. And then we have PhD tracks in chemical engineering, material science, and petroleum. In terms of
you have chemistry,
the chemistry part. Yeah. So in terms of chemistry, I did a postdoc in the chemistry department at Harvard. And so I wanted a courtesy appointment in chemistry. And so at USC, chemistry is in the School of Arts and Sciences. It's not in the School of Engineering. So I have a 0% courtesy appointment in chemistry.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the explanation. The chemists would probably be, they see it's chemical engineering and material science, and then they throw chemistry on the end. They're probably disappointed about that. That's okay. So your group, you are basically an expert in coatings, really at a broad level. That's what you're an expert in. And specifically, a really interesting kind of coating technology called initiated chemical vapor deposition. Can you talk about coatings a bit, where they are, what they help us do, and then maybe about iCVD, how it came to be, what it's good for?
Great. So coatings are very important because a lot of properties that are important happen at that interface between materials. And so what we're doing is we're changing the interface. So you can have, let's say, a bulk material that's very strong, and then we can apply a thin coating, or other technologies also can be used to apply a thin coating, then that makes, let's say, your material hydrophobic, so it repels water, or it can make it hydrophilic, so it absorbs water. We can make temperature responsive and light responsive coatings. So the common example I usually use is Teflon coatings on your pan. So that's just a thin fluorinated coating to make the pans hydrophobic and self-cleaning.
Or like on your pants.
Sure, yeah. So just basically, anything that can be applied on a surface to give it that kind of extra property without changing the mechanical properties of the underlying material, right? So initiated chemical vapor deposition is a technique that my advisor at MIT, Karen Gleason, started in the early 2000s. So previous to that, people had been using vapor phase processes to apply polymer coatings, but the most common processes used high energy sources like plasma. And what could happen was you could break some of your chemical functionalities during deposition. You could have etching.
So real quick, let's take a quick step back, and that you're talking about polymer coatings here. And as obviously distinct from what are the really conventional coatings, which would be oxides and
yes,
things like that, which would also maybe be put down by chemical vapor deposition. But it was these functional
correct.
polymers that iCVD is able to help you deposit.
Correct. So I'm talking about specifically polymer coatings. As you said, CVD and plasma can also be used to make inorganic coatings. So prior to iCVD, plasma was used to also apply polymer coatings. But plasma has a very high energy source. So initiated chemical vapor deposition is basically a situation where you're bringing in your organic precursors, so your monomers, in the vapor phase, and then you have an initiator. So typically we use something like terbutyl peroxide, and we have a hot filament array inside the reactor, and we heat it to modest temperatures, about 200, 250, and that breaks the initiator into free radicals to begin polymerization, but it keeps the monomer intact. So then the monomer and the initiator adsorb to the surface, and you get polymerization on the surface of your substrate.
I see. So if I had to kind of compare the old way and the iCVD way, the old way is put in a bunch of precursors and basically blast them with energy in a plasma. They all kind of break some bonds. They react in weird ways. This is a much more controlled way to do it, kind of like you would do in a condensed phase, where you have an initiator molecule. It creates, say, a radical, and then the chain grows from there in a more controlled way. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So basically, we have a lower temperature process where only the initiation step is activated, but the monomer is kept intact. And so it's a cleaner, more controlled process. Yeah.
Is it just empirical how you find conditions for those filaments that break the initiator, and not the precursor? How is that done?
Yeah, so the temperature is pretty modest. It's about 200 degrees, and that's what the initiator. That's the temperature that the initiator needs, kind of. So we knew that a priori.
Okay.
In terms of making sure that the monomer is kept intact, we do a lot of surface analysis. So we've done extensive, our group, Karen's group, lots of other iCVD groups have done extensive surface characterization using FTIR, so Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. We've used XPS, and all of these techniques to analyze the monomer and the polymer and to confirm that the functional groups of the monomer are retained in the polymer, right? And so we've never seen any kind of destruction, right? So there is rational, analysis that we've done to know that, okay, at about 200 degrees, which is the temperature we need for the filament to break down, we're not really doing anything to our monomer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so these are done at a couple hundred degrees, so it's fairly compatible with a lot of different materials. Can it be conformal like an ALD, like atomic layer deposition?
Sure. But back to temperature briefly, we break the initiator, and then the initiator radicals and the monomer, they diffuse to the surface of the substrate. But the substrate is actually at room temperature or below.
Oh, okay. So it's cool.
Yeah. So unlike, as you said, the common coating techniques out there using CVD processes are for inorganic materials, right? And so in inorganic material synthesis, you usually have hot substrates, right? So you're heating, it's kinetically limited or something like that. In our process, we're actually adsorption limited. So what we cool our substrates, and so we can coat temperature sensitive materials like other polymers, for example, other textiles, just basically very, very, we have mild conditions. So we can coat tissue paper, organic membranes, and all of that.
I saw, and I want to get to this, maybe I'll say it and we'll put it on hold, but you can do deposition on liquids.
Correct.
So let's come back to that, but that's awesome. Okay, so going back to iCVD, so the filament's hot, not super hot. It's hot to break the initiator. The surface is cold. That helps. So tell me about conformality.
Oh yeah, so conformality. So the other difference between, let's say, ALD processes and our process is that ALD is like self-limiting, right? So A reacts with B, reacts with A, reacts with B. For us, since we're making polymers, the big thing about polymers is you've got polydispersity, right? So there's a molecular weight distribution, right? So once you start initiation, you have propagation, you have termination, and so you get a molecular weight distribution, and you get the type of distribution you would get in solution phase.
And to be clear, that just means polymers are different lengths.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's, let's say 100,000 plus minus 10 to 20,000, something like that, right?
Okay.
So you get some kind of distribution. In terms of conformality, in terms of the coating thickness, we are pretty conformal because we're in the vapor phase, so the molecules are diffusing everywhere. And so one of the substrates that we coat the most in my group is cellulose filter paper. So these are porous paper. They have micron-sized porosity. They're basically the filter paper that you use in organic chemistry labs. And we can conformally coat that in the sense that, let's say we're using a fluoropolymer that's hydrophobic. When we apply this onto the cellulose, we see that we have hydrophobicity on the top of the paper and on the bottom of the paper. If we look for the fluorine signal that indicates coating, we see that everywhere. Now, are there small thickness gradients? Potentially, yes. But in terms of, do we get coverage everywhere? Yes.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you, I'm thinking back to the episode with Greg Parsons, who is an ALD person.
Right.
And we'll put links actually in the show notes to the couple of ALD episodes we've had, and also one episode with Lars Pleth Nielsen from Denmark, who is a more traditional coatings expert and has kind of written the Bible on coatings. I wonder if iCVD is in there. I would hope it would be. But okay, that's a conversation for another time.
Mm-hmm.
But Greg was talking about putting these thin ALD layers on certain textiles and making things that were once not resilient to knives be able to repel or block knife cuts. And I was curious if you had any cool examples of functionality. You just gave one kind of, but what are some cool examples of where you've been able to impart functionality that's kind of surprising or counterintuitive?
So my lab mostly works with creating non-stick coatings. So, fluorinated hydrophobic coatings. Right now, because we're thinking about, for sustainability, we're thinking about non-fluorinated coatings that can also give hydrophobic properties. So right now we're moving on to silicon-containing polymers. You can think about that like PDMS and stuff like that can impart that hydrophobicity. The Greg Parsons example is super cool. It's interesting to think about. I don't know what kind of coatings he's using for knife repellency, but
it was like
typically
TiO2 or something.
Okay, yeah. So I would say that his coatings are probably stronger than the coatings. We're not looking at mechanical strength as much as we are looking at coatings to repel things or absorb things, right? That's
do you do
more
any work
our kind of
in the kind of biofouling area?
So I don't, but in my field, plenty of people do. So I will say that other iCVD groups certainly are looking at cationic polymers that can be antimicrobial. Many of the hydrophilic polymers that we can make in our lab, they also are biocompatible, non-fouling. I will say that in my lab, we're going to hopefully talk about some of the liquid work, but I'm more interested in like processing and looking at how we can affect molecular weights and we can make new shapes, and less so on changing the monomer too drastically, if that makes sense. Yeah. But there are other groups certainly other groups have looked at, let's say, using a new type of monomer with a new type of functionality that can give you either biocompatibility or anti-fouling. I will say that, the iCVD process is compatible with at least 30 to 40 monomers currently, and probably several dozen more, because as long as you can heat your monomer and get enough vapor pressure at about 80 degrees, that's what we heat the jar to, you should be able to polymerize it. So there's a variety of acrylates and acrylamides out there that people have been using. So there are a lot of possibilities, and there are a lot of groups out there doing great work.
So let's then talk about process. Any listener of this podcast knows I love to talk about process. So give me an example of a coating where changing the processing, some parameter or some aspect of it, leads to really different behavior, or just makes it possible over larger areas. I'll let you decide what you want to tell us.
So if we deposit hydrophilic polymers, so stuff like hydroxyethyl methacrylate, polymethacrylic acid. So there's a bunch of polymers we can put down that are good. They have, like, as you mentioned, they're have anti-fouling properties, and so maybe you want to put these polymers down on biomedical implants or stents and so forth. But the thing is that if you put these polymers in solution, they will dissolve because they're hydrophilic and they're linear. So one of the processing parameters that we can control is degree of cross-linking. So for those of you listeners who are familiar with polymerization, you can cross-link polymers. So that's like kind of a ladder analogy. So you have these spaghetti strings that are polymers, and then you connect them, right? And you basically get them stuck. So then when they're in the water, they're not going to dissolve, right? So basically, we have multiple feed lines. So earlier in the discussion, we discussed we have an initiator, right? We have a monomer. We can add another component called the crosslinker. So something like ethylene glycol diacrylate. So it's got a double bond on both ends. And so that will cross-link our polymer. And so that sounds great, right? So now we're going to make an anti-fouling coating that's, really robust and won't dissolve. But if you put too much in, so what happens is the common crosslinkers we use tilt the coatings to hydrophobic. So there's, in terms of processing parameters, there is a way to control that crosslinker so that you have enough to prevent dissolution, but also not too much so that your surface remains hydrophilic, right? So that's kind of like where processing parameters, flow rates, pressures, temperatures, and all of that kicks in.
Yeah, okay, cool. So let's talk about iCVD on liquids. Why is that useful? And it sounds really hard. So how do you do it?
Okay, so I think the iCVD onto liquids for me is just a fun project because I went to a conference in 2009 when I started my faculty career, and people were talking about ionic liquids a lot, and they were looking at ionic liquids for solution phase polymerization. And one of the properties on about ionic liquids is that it has low vapor pressure. So it's stable in vacuum systems. So I returned from this conference and I was told my grad students, okay, instead of depositing on solid materials, let's start depositing on ionic liquids. And so instead of just putting the silicon wafer in there, we now, put a droplet of the ionic liquid and we deposit the polymer onto that liquid surface. And it turns out there are other liquids that have low vapor pressure as well, like silicon oils and other types of oils. So we've expanded into looking at silicon oils and other liquids as well. So what I like about this is that it's actually very complicated to deposit onto, to study what is happening when you deposit onto liquids because you have new effects that you see. So surface tension effects can dominate the system, right? Because now you're depositing on a liquid surface. So we see that we sometimes form polymer particles. Sometimes we form polymer films on that liquid vapor interface, depending on this parameter called the spreading coefficient. So that just is dealing with surface tension effects. And then we also have cases where the monomer will absorb into the liquid.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, and then you get polymerization in the bulk. And that's consistent with liquid phase polymerization. So we do have some cases where we can exploit that, the fact that our monomer will absorb and we'll get polymerization, and we can make ionic liquid polymer gels. So basically, and we just published a review paper that basically gives a flow chart of basically depending on the viscosity of your liquid, the surface tension interaction between the polymer and the liquid, depending on the solubility of the monomer in the liquid, you can make polymer gels, you can make polymer particles, you can make thin films. So there's all these cool things you can do by playing with these parameters.
Yeah. Is there any utility to doing deposition on, say particles assembled at an interface, since you can that's compatible with the system?
We did a recent study where we applied ultrasound onto the liquid. while we deposited, but in that example, we looked mostly at films and not particles. But yeah, I think there's endless possibilities of what you can do with this type of system.
There's plenty of science to do. And
yes.
Then it's, but has there been a killer app? Has there been something in technology where this has become really mainstream?
Oh, no. I mean, I think that...
And that's completely fine, by the way. I'm not saying it's not fine, but I was just curious. It will be someday.
Yeah, so I would say that, we run like most academic labs do, where we have our applied projects and we have our more fundamental projects. I would say that this particular project is on the fundamental end. We have collaborations with companies, and because of NDAs, I can't go into too much explanation right now, but for the work that we do that's super applied, those are usually using kind of our more basic coatings on solid materials. And as I said, our repellent coatings or our absorbing coatings. So the traditional things we do actually have a lot of applications. And some of the ionic liquid stuff, I mean, we started it in about, it's been a decade since we've been doing this work. And I think it's really exciting. It's very fundamental. I'm hoping that now that the review paper is out and we've published so much in this area, that people in ALD and Parylene deposition and all the other deposition communities can use some of the knowledge that we have given about surface tension and viscosity effects, and then they can apply that to their systems, and then maybe they'll get some neat applications, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Well.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So within iCVD, then, are there things you're really excited about right now? I mean, sounds like the liquids is one, but what else are you excited about?
Yeah, so the other system that we do that's a departure from traditional, so traditional coatings that we do using iCVD are thin, right? So they're like hundreds of nanometers, they're dense, they're transparent coatings. And we usually apply them right onto textiles, metals, everything like that. But as I said, we have one section of the lab where we deposit onto liquids. But the other section of my lab, we play with another new parameter space where we use a thermoelectric cooler to drop our temperature down even further so that we freeze our monomer before we polymerize it. So the way I explain the system is the monomer comes in and it freezes like icicles, So it kind of, basically looks like icicles on the surface. And then we start polymerization. And then we have a lot of unreacted monomer. And so then we sublimate that. And we're left with these porous structures. And these films are hundreds of microns thick. They kind of look grassy, and they have multi-scale porosity.
Of what scale?
So there's micron scale porosity and like hundreds of nanometers of porosity as well, because so there's two levels of porosity because there's void spaces between the icicles, and then there's an extra level of porosity because as you sublimate the monomer from the structures, you're left with inside pores. Mm-hmm. And so we're excited about that. It's also fundamental in many ways because we are still optimizing the system. And then in terms of applications, there's plenty of applications for those types of coatings because they're porous coatings, so anything you would need a porous coating for. What I'm really excited about and interested, so the new themes in my lab is, since we work in the solvent-free system, we've always said we're environmentally better than a lot of liquid phase processes because we don't have any solvents, right? So if you look at traditional polymerization processes, you have like organic solvent waste, right? So we're not having that. But the thing with this system is that we do still have a lot of unreacted monomer. So one of the challenges in this process is to convert more of the monomer into polymer, so that it's kind of like one of those like fun chemi challenges to reduce weight, reduce waste.
I was going to say, why not just recycle it?
We are. So so one thing we did was downstream capture and polymerization. So we put in more cold traps downstream. And we're looking at, as you said, just like, it's just engineering at that point, right? Because we need to capture the monomer and pump it back in. So just looking at that, and then also so there's 2 times we lose monomer to polymer conversion. One is on the initial capture, and then one is on the polymerization step. So we're looking at optimizing all of those. So it's fun. It's fun to look at that.
I was going to say, I'm reminded of when someone really taught me what it means for a process to be scalable. The process is scalable when you can more or less sell everything you make, and clearly for more money than you bought the inputs for. But people miss so frequently that you need to find processes where everything that's coming out, or as much as possible, is sellable to somebody. And they could be different products, but all those things should be sold to somebody.
Yeah, correct.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, in oil, it's more obvious maybe. There's all the fractions of the oil, but someone wants all those parts of the oil. From the light components to the heavy components. And it's the same thing with any process, and that's what makes it scalable. So that extra monomer that you might turn into something else somewhere downstream, that's fine as long as someone wants to buy it.
Right, correct. Yeah, so just optimizing all our systems. I think the engineer in me is always excited about those projects too, right? How do we also did so in graduate school I worked on roll-to-roll processing using iCVD, and it was a big reactor and big rollers. And so one of the recent projects we did in my lab is that we used our lab scale reactor, but we were able to do roll to roll in there as well. So I do like adding components into our reactor, whether it's a way to recycle the monomer downstream, or whether it's putting rollers in there, and just kind of building new components is always fun as well.
Yeah, you just have to be careful not to get a toaster fridge or a fridge toaster. So I had a question about types of polymer. I mean, can you do like brushes off of a surface?
Yeah. So you mean like grafting polymers? Yeah. So when we do the initiator and monomer and we make polymer chains, those are not grafted. So they're on the surface, probably held together by van der Waals forces, stuff like that. But if you want to graft, there are multiple ways to do it. You just have to activate your surface. So usually we say iCVD is not surface dependent, right? Like I can coat anything. Give me anything, we'll coat it. But if you want to graft, then the surface is important, because you want to introduce some kind of free radical or some vinyl bond onto the surface. And there's multiple ways to do it. You can do, some kind of plasma treatment. You can do, you can introduce a silane to a surface that has like a vinyl group. So there are multiple ways to graft, and many groups, as I said, in iCVD have come up with different ways to do that.
I see. So there's a liquid process, or is that a vapor process to put down that the vinyl?
It depends. So when you do if you do silanol treatment for a silicon wafer, you can do that probably in a desiccator or something, right? If you do plasma, that's also vapor phase. But there's also liquid ways to do it as well. In my group, so another new project we've done, and Karen's group has done something similar, is where you can use the filament as a plasma source in the reactor. So basically, you can try to introduce free radicals onto your surface if you have an organic surface, and then you can try grafting. So that's a way to like not introduce a liquid step, right? In the ideal process, right, everything is done in the reactor, right?
Right. Yeah, I'm asking because we have been doing some work with nanowires where we grow them in the vapor phase, and then to put a polymer brush on the surface, we do that in solution. And it would be really cool if we could put that polymer brush on in another vapor phase process rather than having to put these things into solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the combination of iCVD with metal processing in one reactor hasn't been fully explored yet.
Yeah. Or even like on powders, where powders are moved from reactor to reactor.
Right, right.
I think that's really gaining a lot of steam, is coating of particles, and they're cool, but you can flow them around a plant.
Right.
So but it's the same kind of idea that you want to do kind of multi-step, whether it's in a single reactor for a fixed substrate, or you can actually move the substrate easily from reactor to reactor, or the rolls you were talking about a minute ago.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else you want to tell us about iCVD?
I think that there's more to do in terms of kind of in situ exploration. Right now, we make a lot of these structures and then we take it out and we do SEM on it or XPS. So, of course, there's more ways to explore what's happening in the iCVD process with doing just kind of adding kind of in situ analytical tools and stuff like that. And as you just mentioned, even somehow combining iCVD with metal processing so everything can be done in one reactor would be really cool as well.
Excellent. So I have a bunch of other questions for you.
Sure.
Not so much about the details of your science. I want to start with the article you sent me. The title is Sugar Coating No, Polymer Coatings Yes. And so my first question is, who came up with that title?
Mark, who wrote that article, came up with that title. I did not.
Okay. One of the article we'll put in the show notes, and it talks about, at a high level, your work. One of the passages that caught my attention was the following. It says, Gupta grew up in a family of scientists.
Yes.
Her father is a civil engineer. Her maternal grandfather was a physicist, and her brother is a biophysicist and pathologist. By high school, Gupta knew she wanted to study chemical engineering. And I read that, and I do not understand how you get to chemical engineering from that collection of disciplines.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. Honestly, that article is I don't know. It's pretty old, so I don't remember. So that's okay. So that's not even the reality, I don't think. So I grew up in New York City, actually. So I actually, in high school, I went to a great high school in New York City called Hunter College High School, and there were great humanities courses. And growing up in New York, I actually thought I'd be a lawyer because there were so many around. So let's see. I think I started to decide I wanted to do chemistry, actually, when I was taking AP chemistry with a teacher named Miss Salzman in high school. So I was interested in chemistry, but I wouldn't say that. Okay, so I get what the article says, but the reality is, I was thinking about being a lawyer. Then I took chemistry courses. I really enjoyed those. I said maybe I'll be a chemist.
What's it about chemistry? What is it that you like? Is it the kind of the order of bonding? Is it the complexity of chemistry? What is it? All of the above?
Yeah, I like reactions. I think it's cool. I think it's cool to react things. And I mean, I just in high school, so I wasn't interested in biology. So I was just like, oh, cool. Like, this is how things rearrange. These are how molecules, react. And I liked it. I think the teachers you have can really inspire you as well. So yeah, I enjoyed chemistry. I enjoyed doing the labs too. Honestly, I liked things that, analytical labs and,
Bunsen
all
burners?
of those types. Yeah, all of those things, like figuring out, it's like, CSI stuff, right? Like figure out what molecule this is, figure out what material this is, what is the bond, like
Yeah.
GCMS, like we had GCMS experiments in college, which is just like, here's an unknown, figure out what it is, right? So
Right.
that kind of stuff's cool,
And it takes longer than the 2 minutes that they show you in CSI, right?
Yeah. But it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's like, but I did also, like, there's a big part of me that just wanted to save the world, right? So I was also interested in civil engineering, which is what my dad does. And so I was like, oh, it'd be great to like get clean water to everyone. So I was interested in kind of like civil environmental. And so as I determined that I would probably not make the best lawyer, like,
yeah. My dad was a lawyer. Or my dad is a lawyer, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, I like arguing, but I was like, I was doing really well in math and science, and I was like, I'm gonna go into engineering. So now the question is, chemistry versus chemical engineering versus civil and environmental engineering. And I think a lot of students there's a kind of student that struggles deciding between those three types of topics. And then there's a school called Cooper Union in New York, and that's where I went. And it's a very unique school. It's okay, up to a couple of years ago, for its starting from when it was founded, it's free. It's tuition free for everyone.
Wow.
But it only has three majors. So you have art, architecture, and engineering. It's a very tiny school, and it's unique in the U.S. It's tuition free. It unfortunately had to start charging tuition recently, but they're trying to go back to a tuition free model. And
they do that due to alumni, or there's some other mechanism that makes that work?
I don't know all the details, but the founder, Peter Cooper, helped enable this. It's like, it's endowed and based on all the, I can't go into details because I don't know all the details, but it is, it was tuition free for like 100 years. And, it's in Lower Manhattan. And so they have engineering, architecture, and art. And so I was like, okay, I want to go there. I'll do engineering. They don't have chemistry there as a major. They have classes, but they don't have it as a major. So then I had to decide, okay, chemical engineering or civil and environmental. And, so my parents were like, look, clean water isn't just a technology problem. It's also a policy problem, right? So the issue is that, yes, there are lots of technologies for cleaning water, but the unfortunate truth is sometimes those aren't implemented for policy reasons, right? So,
or cost, or both.
Cost or and unfortunately, corruption, right? And
Sure.
all these things that are they're just not science problems, right? So I was like, okay, that's a fair point. So, and chemical engineering just sounded like infinite possibilities, right, at that time. So I went into chemical engineering, and I've had no regrets, right? Because then I was able to do, analytical chemistry labs and take a bunch of organic chemistry classes. So I got to do all the chemistry I wanted to do. Then I ended up doing a postdoc in chemistry. I have a courtesy in chemistry. So I got all that chemistry I needed. And
still getting that chemistry.
Yeah, and I still got the engineering tool sets. So for me, it was great. Actually right now, one of the projects I have going is with a woman, Amy Childress, in civil and environmental engineering at USC. And so we're doing coatings for desalination membrane. So it kind of came around anyway. So we are interfacing with, people working on water and stuff like that, just from like the coating standpoint, right? So, but yeah, for those of you who are listening who are not sure what they want to do, I think it's okay to not be sure. And I think at the research, and you can bring elements of a lot of the things you're interested in your path, right, and journey forward. But yeah, I wasn't.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that article. It's funny. So there's a recent video. I could send it to you if you want a link to it.
Oh, for sure, 100%.
But I was asked to partake in educational video for Goldie Blocks. I'll send it to you. It was pretty recent, but in the video, they asked me like, "What would you tell your 12-year-old self?" And I was like, "Yeah, I would tell my 12-year-old self like, it's okay to know what, it's okay to not know what you want to do. Like that's fine, right? And it's okay to have like struggles and whatever. Like it's all fine, right?" And I think I said like I wanted to be a lawyer because I like to argue, and it turns out that you know this, Mike, like when we defend our work and when we write proposals and when we answer reviewers' comments, we're actually making arguments, right?
Oh, 100%. Oh, yeah.
So I think I got a little bit of that lawyer stuff in my work too.
We're governed by the laws of the universe, though, versus
we are.
something a little bit more
Right.
shifty and changey.
Right. But you know what I mean when you're in like not for the science part of our jobs, but for the job, like when we're talking about course. Yeah, like when we're talking about, let's say, course development, or we're talking about curriculum changes, or we're talking about things where, you know, as you know, with chemical engineering, we have some traditional courses, but at least in my department, and I think in other departments, we always think about how do we change those course requirements? How do we update it, right? And for that, there's room in making arguments for the way things should evolve, right?
Sure.
And I get to bring that lawyer side in me, and I get to be like, look, here's the way you want to go, and these are the reasons why, right? So, yeah.
No, I think that is absolutely how this works. It's how a lot of things work, whether it's academia or you're fighting for a project to get the green light at a company. You know, it's
right.
You know, you have to be able to support your arguments. I mean, make
Right.
them and support them, and also be ready to be shot down plenty of times and then come back with better arguments or better data. All those kinds of things. So in the remaining time, I was hoping we could go through the lightning round. You've actually kind of touched on a couple of the questions already. So you can simply say if you get to one that you kind of already answered, you could come back to that. But I have about 8 questions that I like to ask at the end of the podcast to give people a sense for who you are, a little bit in and really outside of the laboratory.
Okay.
So let's go. So number 1, what's the most important thing your students don't know about Malancha Gupta?
My fun fact that I always tell like every new class that walks in is like, I don't know how to drive a car. I grew up in New York City,
Right.
So people didn't need cars. And then I was in Boston for a long time, and I don't have a permit. I do not drive a car. So I am a Los Angelino who does not drive a car.
Now that's the weird part. That's the weird part.
But everyone knows this. My students, my colleagues, the entire world.
Now the entire world. Okay. You mentioned, I think, an early chemistry teacher, but who were some of your early mentors?
Yeah, so I had this chemistry teacher, Ms. Salzman. I had great professors at Cooper Union, Andrea Newmark, John Beauvais, Robert Topper. There was great. And then, I got to MIT, and Karen Gleason my advisor, has been a great mentor. The best thing about being an academic scientist is you go to conferences and you see your advisor multiple times a year. So it's great because we're in touch. We see each other so many times a year. And then I did my postdoc with George Whitesides, and that was he's a great mentor as well. So yeah, it's been great.
Okay. What are some of your favorite books, blogs, podcasts, YouTube channels you pick?
So Jean Rice is this woman who took one of the characters in Jane Eyre, and she gave this character a backstory, and it's really cool because she did this, let me see, it's called The Wide Sargasso Sea. Let me see when it was written. Well, the benefits of technology. So it's written in 1966, and she takes a character who, female character who has, doesn't get a story in the book, and she gives her a story. And I think that's happening a lot these days. There are a lot of women who are like, okay, this woman was ignored in the past or in this book or in this movie, and we're going to now rewrite her story. I think there's it's slipping my mind. There was a movie recently where they just shifted the perspective to the female perspective. So I like things like that,
It reminds me a little bit of Wicked, the musical, in a sense, right, where you learn about the Wicked Witch from her perspective.
Yeah. So I
bit.
like stuff like that.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Tell us about a time when you failed and what you learned from that experience.
Let's put it this way. I think, as you know, this job, we fail like once a month, right? Like we submit a proposal and we fail. So I mentor a lot of junior faculty, and I always tell them that most of my grants were funded on the second shot. So basically, on the first shot, I always got denied. I always got comments back, and then I had to resubmit. So I think part of this is like, I can't think of a time, but I could think of lots of littler times, right? And I think that's perseverance, and something like people have to be aware that I think most of us have lots of failures, and that's fine, right? Because that's just how it is.
Agreed. Okay, what do you do for fun?
I love watching. This is super nerdy, but yeah, I just love watching movies and TV. I mean, that's just how I relax. I mean, I just, professors are people too, and I've finished. Yes, I just finished the Witcher series.
Okay.
Carnival Row.
So are you are you like Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus? What are you? Where do you fall in?
Oh, okay. I got like all of it. So we don't. I don't have TV, so I got Hulu. I got Amazon Prime has a lot of stuff on it, and then Netflix. Yeah, all of it. So
all of it. Okay.
Yeah, and so I have all the great, and there's so much great series out there right now, and so it's really nice after a long day at work to come home and just like watch one of my favorite shows. I really enjoy it.
Well, it's really a golden age of television right now. It's really tremendous just how much content is out there.
And as we said, like, just to circle back, like, I'm 39, and I will say that like the programming for women and females has just increased. Like the quality of programming for female audiences has just become so great, right? There's so much TV and movie that I relate to in the last decade that just wasn't there before, and I think that just female comedians are on the rise, and just things that just feel like a better, accurate representation of how how women really are out there now, and that's just really exciting. So I like to watch it.
That's outstanding. I think it's that's clearly obviously a huge portion of the population. But I love that's kind of why this podcast even works, is because you have easy communication, and you see it in television too. There's like, if you take like a 1/X function, right? There's the so-called long tail, which in the past never could be, produced for. And I'm not saying women are part of that long tail, but they're a huge part of the main part of it. And then there's all this other stuff, like I want to listen to a podcast on nanotechnology. That would have never been possible before, right? But what the internet does is it opens that up, and I think that's just generally really exciting.
Yes.
Okay, so a college student comes up to you saying that they're interested in a career in science or engineering. What advice would you give them?
I would ask, like, are you interested on the material side? Are you interested in the petroleum side? Are you interested in the environmental side, we have a new sustainability course. And so I would say there's, I would tell a student to go into science and engineering because there are just so many options out there, right? It's not just like science and engineering. It's like you could go in so many directions with it. You could go on the bio side as well. And so I would sit with the student and try to get into what they're really, truly interested in.
And you can change the world.
Yeah, for sure.
On that note, Malancha Gupta, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at fillerlab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.